Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ask a Property Manager. This is episode number 72 and today is May 26th, 2021. We're coming to you from Studio 2.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker of Own Buffalo Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about the City of Buffalo pushing back their annual tax auction, how to handle rent increases during the pandemic. We're going to answer some questions from housing providers around the country and so much more. Before we jump into all that, we're going to go ahead and plug our social medias. New episode of Ask a Property Manager drops every Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern on our Facebook page. You can catch the replay the same day on Facebook as well as over on our YouTube page. Don't forget about our Instagram. And last but not least, don't forget about the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Current episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast, current episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast is taking a look at putting cosigners on leases, the best tips for managing complaining tenants, and whether or not it's legal to drug test a tenant. It's a very, very interesting episode. Don't miss out on that one. New episodes of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast are currently coming out every other week. You'll see a new episode next week. This is actually the same as last week's episode. We're on that second week of the 2-week cycle. And you can catch that podcast over at rentprep.com/podcast or anywhere that podcasts are heard. We're going to jump right into the news of the day here, and we're going to start with this one because I think this will be of the most importance to the most people. The ERAP program that we talked about last week in episode 71 of the Ask a Property Manager show, applications will be accepted starting June 1st, 2021 at 9 a.m. So as of last week when we covered this, there had not been any sort of an update on the ERAP program as to when the portal was going to open. We now know that that portal is scheduled to open June 1st. That is next Tuesday. Monday's the holiday. Next Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. is when that portal opens. If you're part of the 7 communities that are receiving funds directly, which is City of Rochester, Monroe County, City of Yonkers, Onondaga County, and the towns of Hempstead and Islip, and Oyster Bay, you have to go to your local agency, not the state agency, to fill out this paperwork, and that will be handled at the local level. So if you try to fill out the paperwork for the state level and you're in one of those areas, it's going to kick you out almost immediately as soon as you start that application. Go to your local municipality, and that's how you'll apply. To find this information, head on over to the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance website, otda.ny.gov. Now on to our news of the day. Buffalo pushes back its usual November property auction. This one comes to us from the local NPR affiliate, WBFO. Buffalo's Common Council voted Tuesday to push back the usual November tax auction for properties where taxes haven't been paid. The move comes because so many renters are failing to pay owners. There has been a rent moratorium since the pandemic heated up more than a year ago. That's not accurate. There's been an eviction moratorium since the pandemic heated up more than a year ago. Although one federal court recently threw out the CDC moratorium, leading Albany to recently extend it in New York. The basic idea is that for many landlords, they can't pay their taxes if they aren't receiving any rent, but perhaps they'll have that money by November. There is assistance for tenants, and that money can in turn be paid to their landlords. However, Council President Darius Pridgeon said some renters still don't pay. Unfortunately, it wasn't because they couldn't pay, it was just some of them, they refused to go and get the assistance because they knew that they could just leave when the moratorium is over and it would be very difficult. And shame on those tenants who could have gotten assistance, who wouldn't go and get it and didn't pay their landlords. Pridgeon said the buildings can go on the tax auction sale with little owed to the city. For $200 worth of back bills over an extended period of time, someone could lose their home, someone could lose their land, and I just feel we need more time, he said. And what we have been told is that if we have the auction later, we would still be okay with our budget. The money paid during the auction goes directly into the city coffers, and every year the city budget includes estimated revenue from the auction. University District Council member Rashid Wyatt supports the delay. I learned a lesson from the school zone cameras because we have to look at how we legislate, she said. Buffalo is one of the third poorest cities in America, and we continue to do things that in some cases may not be beneficial for people who are struggling. So this is a piece of legislation. I think it's smart. I think it takes into consideration the struggles of folks, and I think that in the future we need to continue to do that. It's not clear when the auction will be held. The replacement date has to be set early enough in the next calendar year for the money to come in during this coming fiscal year. So there you have it, right there, right from Council President Darius Pridgeon. He says it himself. Unfortunately, it wasn't because they couldn't necessarily pay. Some of them just plain refused. And that's a disappointment, but it is a fact of life that we're dealing with, not just here in Buffalo, but really across the entire nation. There are people who are deeply impacted by this. And I'm not taking away from those people, but there are also people who are abusing the system. And that's one of the main reasons that I think that this eviction moratorium needs to come to a halt. There are people who are legitimately abusing the system, and there are people who are legitimately in need of help. We need to start separating the two groups and getting rid of the people who are playing the system on this one, at least in my opinion. All right, how about a little bit lighter news? This one comes from the Buffalo News. Derek Jeter sells his Tampa mansion that Tom Brady has been renting. Former New York Yankees superstar Derek Jeter has sold his waterfront mansion in Tampa for $22.5 million, meaning Tom Brady might be headed to new rental digs. The 7-bedroom, 8-bath estate was sold on Friday, said Smith & Associates, the real estate firm that handled the transaction. The firm did not disclose the buyer, and the sale has not yet been recorded as of Monday by Hillsborough County, a process that could take several days. The home had been listed at $29 million. The former Hall of Famer lived in the home part-time until his retirement after the 2014 season. He and his family moved across Florida after he became a part owner and CEO of the Miami Marlins in 2017. Brady has been residing in the mansion since April 2020, shortly after the star quarterback signed with Tampa Bay Buccaneers after leaving the New England Patriots. He and his wife, supermodel Gisele Bündchen, I don't know if I pronounced that right, recently purchased land on an exclusive island off Miami to build a home there. Brady led the Bucs to a Super Bowl title in February. Jeter bought the property in 2005 for $6.3 million, raised the homes that were there, and built the 22,000 square foot replacement, which has a wine cellar, movie theater, and an air-conditioned 6-car garage. Smith & Associates realtor Stephen Gray told the Tampa Bay Times that Brady and Bündchen were accommodating and didn't turn down any request to get the property show-ready for a prospective buyer. Let's take a quick look at this house. It is stunning. Just a gorgeous home. I know it doesn't necessarily tickle everyone's fancy, but just looking at some of the photos of this, the movie theater, I love the inlay tray lighting in the ceiling. Beautiful views. Just a stunning home, in my opinion. $22.5 million. I guess this is what $22.5 million gets you. That's a monster gym as well. Beautiful dock. You have your own slip. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. I love the kitchen. I love the spiral staircase. I love the wet bar. There's not much about this home that I don't love. But anyway, that was just a little bit lighter news story, something that I thought might break things up a little bit since we've been talking about some fairly heavy news stories here lately. We're going to go ahead and jump over to our humor. This week we're talking about structural damage and how to go about fixing it. If this is how your contractor wants to build something, you need a new contractor, I'm sorry to say. I think my favorite portion of this picture is the fact that the whole thing is held up by what looks to be 1 or 2 cinder blocks on that leading edge there. And then this one, I don't know where this came out of, but could you imagine just being somewhere and seeing this and just, oh yeah, that's totally fine. They literally have what looks to be ratchet straps, like long ratchet straps. And I'm sure they're not. I'm sure there's some sort of actual strap. But they're just tied together to make longer ones. It's absolutely insane. Hopefully that's a situation that gets remedied rather quickly. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our questions from housing providers around the country. Commercial tenant maintenance is the topic of our first one. I had one of my business tenants reach out explaining that his expense for snow removal this season was $700. He's asking if there's something we can do about this. Snow removal is his responsibility and it's stated in the lease. We did get more snow than usual. I know the pandemic didn't help. He is a very good tenant and always pays on time and gets along well with the other tenant. What would you do? I would do absolutely nothing in this instance. You said it yourself. Snow removal is his responsibility and it's stated in the lease, which means that he's responsible for it. So he had the option of clearing the snow himself. He had the option of hiring a service, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, he's responsible for that snow removal. He chose to engage a vendor to come out and do that work on his behalf. He's responsible for that bill. And I would remind the tenant of that. This is one of those things. It doesn't have to be confrontational. I would have probably just a phone call with them at first, but I would follow it up with just a basic letter to them, including the relevant text from their lease. Maybe take a copy of that page of the lease and highlight the relevant section, just so that they understand that, okay, yep, that is what's in the lease, and I understand that that's what's in the lease. This is my responsibility, and I would move on. I don't think that this is going to be a big deal in the long term. I think that this is something that the tenant is probably just trying to see if they can get a rent credit or something along those lines. But in this instance, it's pretty clear that the tenant's responsible for that bill, so I would probably just refer them back to their lease and move on from there. Question number 2, charging for installer damage. So the text on this is a little bit small. Writing my damage report for a move out, would you charge for damages for removal of this internet box? And essentially what we have here is an AT&T broadband box and what looks to me to be a piece of Ethernet that runs up the corner of the wall. So I wouldn't charge the tenant for this, and I would not remove this from the property. I would probably actually consider grabbing one of those plastic wire runs from Home Depot or Lowe's to stick in the area just to make it look a little bit neater. But I don't see any reason to remove this. So at least here in Western New York, we're very limited on internet service providers. You basically have the choice of Verizon or Spectrum. Those are your options. So if the incoming tenant, the next tenant, chooses either Verizon or Spectrum, there's a good chance that those wires will be able to be reused by that tenant. And then that way you're not winding up with even more holes punctured in your property, more stuff run where you don't necessarily want it, and things of that nature. So I don't love this install. I think it was a quick install by a sloppy installer, but I wouldn't tear it out necessarily. I would leave it for the next tenant, I think. All of that being said, I do want to show you guys a couple of things that we do. We'll start with, let me switch over to desktop here. We'll start with this clause in our lease. If the tenant wishes to have any service installed that requires drilling through the walls of the property, landlord must be contacted at least 48 hours ahead of time to provide tenant with instructions as to where holes may be drilled. Landlord will also provide a letter of authorization for the utility contractor who will be completing the work with instructions. In the event that the tenant does not obtain permission for drilling or the tenant's contractor fails to obtain authorization or follow instructions, tenant will be held responsible for all damages. At no time may any holes be made in the roof of the property for any reason. So obviously this is a lease clause. It's one of those lease clauses that you would hope would be followed, but oftentimes is not. And it's one of those things that you do have the option at that point of charging the tenant if the damage is severe, or if you decide that you need to remove the internet wiring or whatever. You have an option there. In this instance, I wouldn't charge it because I would leave it, to be honest with you. I'd leave it and I would probably improve it just to make it a little bit neater because I think somebody else is going to use that same wire on the next tenancy. So I would probably leave it. I would not charge the tenant in this instance, even though I have the authority to. I will go back to desktop here real quick. This does mention that we have a letter that we provide, and I'll show you the letter as well. It's actually very straightforward. It's a letter to the tenant giving them authorization for cable, satellite, or internet to be installed. Please hand this to the letter to the installer as referenced when asked. And it says right on here, satellite may not be mounted on the roof or side, must be mounted on a pole in the grassy yard or of the property. This gets ignored more often than not by installers. I'm not going to lie. Most of them, realistically speaking, an installer is supposed to have an authorization letter before they even step foot on the property if it's a leased property. I don't know if this is a nationwide thing or if this is just a Western New York thing, but more often than not, they don't do it. And then they wind up putting a satellite dish on a roof or mounting it on the wall of the property. Then we catch it, and then we force them to come back out and, number one, move the dish, and number two, we make them pay for the repair to the wall or to the roof. I can remember a few years back, we had put a brand new roof on a property, and 2 weeks later, I had a satellite dish sticking off of the brand new roof, and I flipped. The installer had to come back out and move the satellite dish to a pole in the yard, just the same as they were supposed to the first time. And they had to pay our contractor to come back out and fix the holes that they put in the roof. So it's not worth it for the installer to have to do that frequently. They should, in theory, be getting these authorization letters, but a lot of them simply don't. So that's how we handle it in our office. Tenants are supposed to call and get an authorization letter. Installers are supposed to ask for the authorization letter. Does either one of those happen on a regular basis? Typically not, unfortunately. But that's why we have the lease. That's why we have that written right into our lease, that if there is damage caused by the tenant's contractor or they fail to obtain authorization or follow instructions, we have the ability to hold them responsible for damages, and that's why we do it that way. So your mileage may vary on something like that. I would recommend getting some sort of a policy in place when it comes to renting to tenants and how to have the services that they're looking for installed, have an authorization letter, maybe include it right on your lease so they have the authorization from day one to do what they need to do. But if you spell out how you want the wiring run and things like that, generally speaking, if you can prove that you handed the installer that letter or that you handed the tenant that letter and that they were aware of it and the installer didn't follow those instructions, they're going to be on the hook for that repair. So that's just something to keep in mind. Best of luck to you as you turn your apartment over and look for your next tenant. Rent increases during the pandemic. This is going to be an interesting one. We actually have two separate questions here, and they're pretty related, so I decided to include them both on one. First one is, how has everyone handled rent increases during COVID? I laid low while my state's termination moratorium has been in place, but I plan on attempting to catch up once that ends on July 1st. The second one is another tangentially related question on rent increases. Hi guys, we're buying a duplex and need to raise the rents to get them to market, $200 and $400 respectively. Any advice on best practices would be extremely helpful. Do we do it all at once? We understand the tenants have been paying on time, but we do not know that for sure. So I'll start this off by saying that we've actually continued to raise rents as we renew leases throughout the pandemic. If anything, your expenses are about to be increasing substantially in the form of higher taxes, higher maintenance costs, higher material costs, higher labor costs, higher administrative costs. Everything is going up right now. And so your rents need to increase to offset those costs. I mean, that's part of doing business. As for increasing the rents, you're going to have to know what you can do to legally increase rents in your area. So in the state of New York, there are restrictions on how much you can increase rent and how much notice you have to give. And actually, it's more of how much notice you have to give before you can increase rent. There's not a cap per se. There's just different notice requirements. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think every state has a little bit different laws on that. So we won't get into all of that here. But that's something to keep in mind. So again, increasing rents, you're going to want to make sure that you know how to do that legally inside of your state. Excuse me. As for the second question, we're going to dig into this one a little bit deeper. So you're talking about buying a duplex, and it's worth noting that in the state of New York, the lease survives the sale of the property. And what that means is you're responsible for the administration of that lease, and you're responsible to that tenant for the duration of their lease term. You can't make a bunch of changes to their lease. Well, I guess it depends on how the lease is written, but realistically speaking, you're not going to be able to make a bunch of changes to their lease while they're in their current lease term. $200 and $400 under market value is pretty substantial, and those rents definitely need to come up. I probably would not do it all in one shot, and the reason I say that is because unless the rents are super, super low, when you're talking about increasing rents by $2,400 a year and $4,800 a year respectively, that's a pretty substantial increase in rent burden on a tenant, and they're going to be looking to move right away, I would think. So if that's what you're trying to do is force a turnover, then maybe this is the route that you want to go. If you're not trying to force a turnover, I probably would not make these rent bumps all in 1 year, $200 and then $400 on the other in 1 year. That's a substantial jump. I don't think I would raise them all at once, all that amount. It just depends on what first, what your state laws allow, and then second, what your ultimate goals are to keep the tenants or to get the units vacated. I also do have some concerns about you buying a property and not knowing if the tenants are paying rent or not. At the very least, you should be getting some sort of a ledger showing the tenants are paying rent that can be backed up against the seller's bank statements. At this time, with everything going on in the world, we are still in the middle of the pandemic and things of that nature. I'm not taking anybody's word for it that they're receiving rent money on time. I want to see a ledger backed up by a bank statement showing that the rents are coming in on a monthly basis. I think that's probably the best possible way that you can safeguard yourself when you're buying a property. And I would be very, very cautious about buying a property without having that information, just because it does put you at risk. If those tenants are not currently paying rent, if you're in a state where you cannot evict right now, you might be really stuck. You might be underwater before you can even get those tenants out of the building. So that's how I would handle that particular situation. At the end of the day, I strongly recommend that you increase rents on a yearly basis. If you're in an area where it's permitted, or you're going to find yourself underwater sooner rather than later, try to stick to market rent as much as possible, because eventually you're going to find yourself in a situation where you have trouble catching up to market rent simply because you've fallen so far behind, or because there's a cap on what you can increase on a yearly basis. Whatever the case may be, try to stick as close to market rents whenever possible and keep your properties in market rent condition. Those two things go hand in hand. If you're going to charge market rent, you need to have a market rent property. And sometimes landlords forget about that, which frankly creates a whole new set of situations if you're trying to charge a premium for a non-premium product, essentially. So there you have it. That's my thoughts on rent increases during the pandemic, before the pandemic, and after the pandemic. We try to go for that increase on a yearly basis because everybody's expenses go up every single year. This year's no exception. As a matter of fact, this year everybody's expenses seem to be going up at a much more substantial rate than in other years. So that's how I would handle that particular situation. So that pretty much wraps things up for this week's episode of the Ask a Property Manager show. Thank you all so much for watching. We truly do appreciate it. We love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you can definitely help us to improve by dropping a question in the comments either on Facebook or on YouTube, and your question may be answered in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content or if we brought some value to you today, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, so every like, comment, subscribe, and share helps us to grow and reach more people. We'll be back next week on June 2nd, that's next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern with another show you won't want to miss. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.